I'm Reverend Phil, and I'm your host for Words of the Prophets. Where are our prophets now? Where are those messengers God chooses to communicate divine revelation through? In the past, the Creator sent prophets like Abraham, Siddhartha, Jesus, Muhammad, and many more. Maybe our higher power has switched tactics since we reinterpret God's words as soon as the Creator's prophets leave us. Could it be that Spirit talks to each one of us individually and we haven't learned to listen? On Words of the Prophets, our modern prophets show us how to find the internal prophet that is the I Am, and we discuss the application of spiritual principles in all aspects of our lives. Love and light, everybody. I'm Reverend Phil, and I'm your host for Words of the Prophets. Today, our show is going to be a panel discussion. This is the panel. And we're going to be talking about a topic of forgiveness. Our prophetic topic is, only as ye forgive, may ye be forgiven. And our topic can be found in an Edgar Casey reading, number 1348-1, which was given on March 17th, 1938. The complete statement reads as follows: For as ye measure to the fellow man, it is measured to thee again. This is an unchangeable law. For as ye ask for forgiveness only in those measures in which ye forgive, may ye be forgiven. For are ye not seeking to be one with him? Then only as ye forgive, may ye be forgiven. Only as ye show forth love, may love be shown forth to thee. Ye cannot rise above that as ye measure, that as ye live. For as the expression of life is the manifestation of that love, then in the measure of its meats, so it measured to thee. And we're going to talk about what I think is the universal concept of forgiveness. But before that, I'm going to let my panel introduce themselves, the congregations, who they are, where they are, and then we'll pick up the topic. So, Don, do you want to start?
My name is Don Handrick. I'm the resident teacher at Thupten Norbuling Tibetan Buddhist Center. We follow the tradition of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, part of a larger organization called the Foundation for the Preservation of the Mahayana Tradition. Our founders are Lama Yeshe and Lama Zopa.
Well, tell them where you are.
Oh, we're located over on 2nd Street, 1807 2nd Street in the 2nd Street Studio Complex, suite number 35, right across from Backroad Pizza.
Okay.
And I'm Reverend Brindalyn Batchelor, and I'm the minister at Unity Santa Fe. And we are a spiritual community that really supports people with positive spiritual teachings that empower you to live a more abundant and meaningful life. And my personal commitment is to support you in knowing your magnificence and your absolute unlimited potential to live your life centered in peace, wisdom, and love with effortless ease, grace, and joy, so that no one or no thing can disturb you, no matter what. And we are located off of 599 at mile marker 12. Our address is 1212 Unity Way.
Thank you.
I'm Mordechai Sher. I serve as the Rabbi of Kol Barama, also known as the Torah Learning Center of Santa Fe. And we're a small, traditional Jewish institution. We promote the study of Torah as much as possible from original texts and in as much as possible in a traditional manner. We're located on Cordova Road, right over by Maria's Restaurant, sort of across from Trader Joe's. So I think we're kind of around the corner from you.
On the other side of St. Francis, so
Oh,
we're on
right.
the south side. So yeah.
Father Richard Murphy, happily retired from congregational ministry for this past year and a half. I like to tell folks that I've retired from a paycheck at my former church at St. Bede's and am busier than ever. And also describe myself probably as a freelancer because I'm filling in a number of churches in northern New Mexico and out in Navajo land. Great to be here.
Thank you all for coming. If you haven't picked up on it in the introductions, what I wanted to do and what I was successful in doing was getting a cross-section, a variety of different practices to talk about the universality of forgiveness. So let's just throw this out to whoever wants to drop in and answer it. But is forgiveness a concept in your tradition?
Can we answer with one word and say yes?
Yes, absolutely.
We're big on forgiveness.
Yes.
Okay. How does it root? How does it grow? How does your traditions talk about forgiveness? How do they bring it forward? How do they demonstrate it? Or maybe even better yet, let's define forgiveness.
I'm waiting to learn from others on that definition.
Okay, the basic definition I came up with online was the act of excusing a mistake or offense.
I would, I'll jump in, I guess. I mean, in Jewish tradition, especially in the more mystical aspects of the tradition, there's forgiveness. We don't have one word. It's sort of like that cliche about, Eskimos having lots of vocabularies for snow. So we have actually several words that all relate to the idea of forgiveness, but they're part of a construct. So we have slicha, we have mechila, we have kapara, and all of them really interact with teshuvah. So the notion of slicha tends to sort of be the forbearance and the opening. In other words, forgiveness presumes that somebody has offended somebody else, whether man has offended God or whether a person has offended another person. So silicha, which in contemporary Hebrew you'd say slicha when you offend somebody, sorry. So what you're doing is you're asking for your opening. And if you are providing silicha, then like when in the Torah God says to Moses, salachti kidvarecha, I forgave as you requested. So it means I provided the opening. It doesn't mean the process is all done and forgotten. Mechila then moves us into more of a correction of the relationship because some kind of damage was done, whether it was physical or metaphysical. And then the notion, slicha and mechila, those first two stages are something that a person can do with another person. It's something they can ask God for, they can initiate. But kapara, to really restore the balance, I was thinking about that reading that you used for the opening, which I'm not personally familiar with, but this idea of wanting to draw close to God, if that's the balance we want, and if that's the balance we damaged, so that last bit, kapara, is something we as people can work for, but only God could provide. Only God could provide that rectification. So we have all of this, and all of this in Judaism, all of this is tied in with the notion of teshuvah, which has no single real translation in English, but it's sort of penitence and repentance combined. We predicate the idea that forgiveness is something that you have to earn in some way, whether it's because you harmed someone and you need to make good on how you harmed them in addition to asking for forgiveness. Both are needed. Or if you sinned against God directly, then again, you still have to show some kind of an effort at changing that. So that's kind of an opening.
So the opening allows the dialogue to continue.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, let me ask a question. We'll go around, let you all cover it in your own fashion too, but what happens if it's forgiveness about self?
You mean a person forgiving himself?
Yes.
Well, there too. And here I mean, we have a very wise secular model we can draw from, although there's a religious root to it in terms of Alcoholics Anonymous and some of the 12-step programs where we talk about people fixing themselves and forgiving themselves, but you have to hold yourself responsible first. Mm-hmm. The first thing is to accept the responsibility. The next thing is, if you're going to forgive yourself, you can't let yourself off the hook too easily. King David says, "Chatati kenegdi tamid." My sin is always before me. I keep myself reminded, whether that means he just doesn't want to let himself backslide, or whether that means maybe he hasn't finished the task. There's still work to be done. So if you're going to forgive yourself, you have to also sort of convince yourself that you're making a change.
Yeah.
And I mean, that notion of forgiveness in that sense, then, forgiving myself is no different than asking Father Murphy to forgive me or asking God to forgive me. I have to be making a change in order to be, not only in order to be deserving of the forgiveness, but even to make myself a receptacle for the forgiveness.
Next.
I'd pick
I'm
up on
done
that
for the hour.
and follow. In the Christian tradition, we're in the season of Lent, which is traditionally a season of penitence and a season of repentance. And to pick up on what the rabbi said, at the heart of repentance and at the heart of forgiveness is the notion of conversion and transformation. And I think this is sometimes where people get caught up in thinking of negative aspects of forgiveness. But the idea is to come through this process as a changed person, being transformed, being converted. But that's a lifelong process. It just doesn't, happen. People, the old days, would think of giving up ice cream or something from Lent was part of the practice, but it's a much more internal process.
Don't I have to start with forgiveness and then somewhere down the road hold to that demonstration?
I think we have to start with self-forgiveness.
Yes.
Absolutely.
I would say no, personally.
Okay.
I don't mean that as a complete contradiction, but I think rather than saying I would start with self-forgiveness, and again, this is just from a Jewish perspective. I don't even want to claim that I'm giving the definitive Jewish perspective, but from a Jewish perspective, it wouldn't be starting with forgiveness, it would be starting with the hope that I can do this.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's a real good point.
When you look at the story of Cain and Abel, shortly before Cain kills his brother. So the brothers started by bringing offerings to God. One is accepted and one isn't. And that engenders anger, and that brings about a whole dynamic which eventually ends up with Cain killing his brother. But before this, is a very interesting, I think it's a key statement there for this whole idea that goes into the difference between hope and self-forgiveness, where Cain says, Chatati gadol minso. My sin, because you, God, just rejected me. My brother made an offering, I made an offering, you accepted his, you didn't accept mine. I feel not only rejected, but dejected. And so my sin is, Chatati gadol minso. My sin is greater than I can bear. So what does God respond to him? He says, your sin is crouched right outside the door waiting for you. If you want, sa'et, you can bear it. You can burden, you can shoulder the burden, and you can overcome where you are right now. But if you remain in this state of despair that you're in right now, then you have no hope, essentially. That's what happens. And of course, we all know how the story continues from there. So that's why I say, I'm not sure that forgiveness to me is too complete a thing to start with. But to start with the idea that that we can shoulder the burden, that God gives us that ability and even that responsibility, and that with that ability I can then work towards that forgiveness, both self-forgiveness and forgiveness from others. That I think is absolutely essential. That's what God is telling Cain. That's the message Cain didn't hear, and that's why the story ends in the tragedy it does.
Yeah, and I was going to say, that there has to be a willingness, along that same line, a willingness to forgive, or to even ask for self-forgiveness or whatever. And in Unity, we talk about, in our basic textbook, Lessons in Truth, we talk about giving love for, is what forgiveness is all about. Giving love for whatever has been done to us, and that, it's huge. It's huge, and there, to be able to prepare yourself to do that is really essential before you can actually do it. And so sometimes we even have to become willing, or at least I do, willing to become willing to. And I didn't like your definition you got off the web, because I don't think it's excusing. I don't think it's about excusing behavior for me. that it's about letting it go, and I'm not going to carry it around. And certainly in the Buddhist tradition, where, you know, the Buddha said, you know, if you pick up a hot coal to throw it at another, you know, you're the one getting burned. And so to me, forgiveness is about letting go of whatever is blocking the flow of God through me, the life, the love of God, getting rid of that congestion, that constriction.
Okay. Don?
Well, coming from the Buddhist tradition where we don't have a belief in a creator God, it's a slightly different perspective perhaps, because everything is rooted in the basic teachings the Buddha gave in terms of karma and in terms of what are the causes of our suffering. And so when we talk about forgiveness, we can see it. I was thinking through, you know, what's the best way to encapsulate these teachings. We can think it through from the side of the person who is being forgiven and from the side of the person who is forgiving. And from the side of the person who's being forgiven, the purpose for forgiveness and the rationale for forgiveness is that we understand that each of us are the creators of our own suffering through the acts that we do. So anyone who is doing something that would offend you, that would cause you to experience any harm or pain, is under the control of their own delusions in their own mind that are causing them to do that. The analogy that's often used is if your own mother, who is very dear to you, were taking some sort of medicine that made her crazy, you would not expect that she's that crazy person. You know that she's a sane person underneath all that craziness. And at some level, this is what we mean by Buddha nature, that every single being at their very core is pure in their being. And what is happening at the time is adventitious based on the fact that they simply don't know how to control their own minds. Not that we're taking them off the hook, but understanding that everyone works with their own minds to the extent that they can. In other words, they're all doing the best that they can. So the forgiveness for the other person is understanding it with compassion. You know, understanding from our side that this is the state that they're engaging in, and why should we hold on to our anger or resentment towards them? Because it's like that analogy, it's just burning ourselves. It's causing us to experience suffering if we don't let go of that. So the karmic element of understanding that this is a mechanism by which we either create happiness or we create more suffering. Through forgiveness, we create happiness. Through holding on to things and being resentful, we create more suffering.
I want to explore that a little bit further down the line. I want to talk a little bit about my own experience with forgiveness, because it's kind of, sounds like to me at least, a little bit different. I grew up in a dysfunctional family. Okay. Anytime as a child I did something, everything I had done prior to that was thrown back at me, including what I had just done. So I never really got a concept of forgiveness. Everything was just constantly being put back out there. And I heard the word as I got through school, but I never knew what it really meant. I had no practical demonstrations. I became a drug addict. I practiced that particular form of behavior for 26 years. And then I got into a 12-step recovery program. Now, the other part of the story is I had no belief in God or any such entity or deity or whatever. And I wasn't looking at Buddhism either. There was just no interest there. So when I got to the second step, coming to believe, and it was a suggestion initially that what I come to believe in was loving and caring. I had to go through a process where there was a question that really guided me to believe that there was actually something there. And that question was, were there ever times, in spite of your best thinking, feeling, and actions, that the consequences were not as severe as they could or should have been? And when I started to look at my life as an active addict through that context, it was overwhelming how many times consequences should have been greater. And at that point, my sponsor, the person who guides you through the 12 steps, asked me, now, if this power is loving and caring. And all these consequences were minimized. Does that show also forgiveness? And that was the first time I had any idea of forgiveness. And then getting ready to go into the third step, which is to turn my will and my life over, I was told that if the power I was believing in was forgiving me, how could I not forgive myself? And then how could I not forgive others? And that was the only example I actually could wrap my brain around of what forgiveness looked like. So for me, and so my questions are coming from that experience, and that are forming what I put into this dialogue. That I had to start forgiving myself, not just for my drug use, but for everything that came with it, behind it, around it, before it, before I could actually start going on, to do the rest of the steps, to start to change my life. I had to forgive myself for, what is that phrase it's somewhere in the Bible, omissions and commissions. Not only the things I did, but the things I did not do at any given time, because I just didn't believe I was capable of it, or I was too busy getting loaded to even contemplate doing something of that nature. So I guess my question back to all of you is, how does that fit in with the definitions you have?
Well, for me, I think of the story of the prodigal son. And when he went to the far country and wound up with the pigs, which was not a good place for a Jewish boy to be, once he realized that the error of his ways, if you will, and it says, and he turned around and went to the Father. Okay, so repentance is about turning around. As soon as I change my ways, I am forgiven. The forgiveness is there. I don't have to ask for it. There's nowhere in that story that says the Father forgave him. It's just understood that he was welcomed with open arms. So it's the action of that action of repentance, of amends, if you will, living amends, we call it in 12-step work, where we quit doing what we were doing. And as soon as that we quit doing that, the forgiveness of the universe, or whatever you want to call it, God, Creator, Spirit is there, and it starts to heal me.
From the outside in or from the inside out?
Well, it's all one. Yeah, I mean, for me, it feels like it just comes to me that it's from the inside out.
I think, and I think it's happening at once as we're transformed within. Then that transformation, within my terminology, carries with it a grace that affects the rest of the world. Martin Luther King talked about the establishment of the beloved community, and he defined it as a community based on reconciliation and restoration. I think it was restoration and reconciliation. Could be mistaken on that. But I think that's part of we've got to have a consciousness in the process of that transformation, that we're not only transforming our own lives, but the community is becoming transformed as a result of our actions, as a grace, a spirit that's imparted.
The community doesn't necessarily get the same thing as the individual, or vice versa. I mean, again, why do I always default back to drugs?
Because you learned a lot from them. Yeah. That was the good that came out of it.
I agree, and I'm going to get to that soon, but take the fictitious South American head of a drug cartel, builds a church or builds a hospital within their town or their community. Community benefits. They still go on dealing the drugs and destroying thousands of lives. I mean, so there's an external benefit, but is there really an internal benefit?
It's about consciousness. I mean,
Yeah.
in
So
Unity
it's the
Santa
intention,
Fe,
yes.
our mission is to raise consciousness, transform lives, and heal the planet. And we always say one person at a time, beginning with me. But when I raise my consciousness, not only do I transform my lives, I make a difference in the lives of others. And I do my part in healing the planet. But it's not on a tangible level that I can point to and say, you know, there's my good I'm doing in the community. But in our oneness, which I believe we are all one, I'm not my brother's keeper, I am my brother, then I am making a difference when I forgive.
I mean, I would say self-forgiveness in the Buddhist tradition comes from recognizing that we have unhealthy attitudes towards the actions that we've done ourselves, and we have healthy attitudes. The first one, of course, is denial. If we're just totally denying that we've done anything wrong, well, then you have no platform upon which to grow. The second one is blame, that we're somehow blaming others for what we ourselves have done, that in some ways it's the people around us or other people who influenced us or somehow gave us that doorway into those actions. We have to take personal responsibility. And then the third one would be guilt. It's interesting, in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, there isn't even a word for guilt. Guilt is not.
That's why it never took off in Ireland.
But, you know, in our Western culture, there's loads of guilt. You know, I grew up Catholic, and I got my share of guilt. And so, basically, guilt doesn't really. It's not a productive state of mind, because it's putting oneself down. In essence, it's not acknowledging sort of our inner divinity, our inner holiness. The fourth one that is the appropriate response to self-forgiveness is regret, where we responsibly acknowledge that what we have done has not been of the most benefit to ourselves or to others, and we sincerely regret it. If we could take it back, we would, but we have to come from the place that we're at and acknowledge that we didn't have the strength of mind to be able to refrain from it. So it begins with a process of understanding that very simple thought of regret, that is taking responsibility.
I think with the similarities in what I'm hearing, I think also in Jewish tradition we have some significant different, or maybe different, maybe additional, but I think it's different emphasis. So to talk about a concept like forgiveness in Judaism, I mean, we have to really see it within the context of the whole operant model of the Torah. And the Torah, of course, has a lot of very down-to-earth commandments and laws in it. There's things in there about theft and damages and what have you, just like there's things in there about how to worship God and things that are less earthly and less material. A fundamental notion in Jewish tradition is that, for instance, if I harm someone, maybe directly cause them bodily harm, or maybe I cause them property damage. So in the Torah, for instance, if we look shortly after the giving the Torah at Sinai, around Exodus 19, 20, around there, right after that, the Torah segues into a whole lot of property laws. And if we look there, we see, for instance, if I cause damage, I have to make good on the damage that I caused. But the halakha, the Jewish legal tradition, tells us that the offender doesn't just get off by having made good on the damage they caused. They also have to ask forgiveness. So if I damage your car, and I say, here, $500, that'll pay for the damage, and I turn around and walk off, from a Jewish perspective of forgiveness, I'm not off the hook yet. Even though I made good, even though I made whole and the car is fixed and you took my money, and I didn't say, forgive me, please. I'm sorry for what I did to you. So for us, this is a critical issue. Because I was hearing, when you were talking about, if you make things right, then there's sort of a grace that comes into play. So from our perspective, there's a step in between, which is critical, which is you have to ask for forgiveness. You have to express not only your contrition, I'm sorry, but you actually have to say, and I want you to forgive me.
Is there an attachment to sincerity in that statement?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Oh, absolutely.
Oh, yeah.
This is, the prophets of Israel, when you look in Isaiah and Jeremiah, later prophets, Hosea, you see to our mind, from a traditional Jewish perspective, it's a mistaken reading to read into some of those prophets, God doesn't want sacrifices anymore. That's not what he's saying. But what he's saying is, don't bring me these sacrifices if you're still behaving the same way you've been behaving all along anyway. The sacrifices are the least of what I need in this process. Most of what I need is the contrition and, as you mentioned earlier, the conversion, the change in behavior. The Rambam, in formulating in the laws of repentance in the Mishnah Torah, has a really interesting phrase, which makes this whole thing actually very challenging, but at the same time, kind of exalted. He says, when the person doing teshuvah, you talked about a turning, and the verb in Hebrew is lashuv, to turn or to return. We don't talk about doing penitence or repentance. We talk about turning to God, returning to God. So the person doing teshuvah, the Rambam says, has to do it at such depth, such personal depth, ad she'yid yudei talumot, until the one who knows all secrets will be the one that bears testimony he's not the same person he was before. That's the key thing right there. That's the key thing right there. And then, certainly from my perspective, what happens is my relationship with God just changed entirely, because God is seeing somebody else before him. Maybe from your perspective, and please forgive me if I'm getting this wrong, but even without that, what happens is the person has totally changed himself. And in changing himself, he's changed the whole way he influences the world that he's in. That changes the whole environment, that changes all the rules of the game.
Yeah, I guess I look at it from the perspective of, because there's two parties involved, I can't take responsibility for what the other person is doing necessarily, but I can take responsibility for my own forgiveness.
Okay.
And so I see no error from my side of forgiving someone, regardless of, even if they're still committing what they're doing, still having a mind of forgiveness.
Oh, that's interesting.
Because I understand that they're driven by their own delusions to do the things that they're doing. Now, from my compassion, I also want to help them. I also want to try to find a way to help them to address the behaviors that they're doing that are harming themselves and others.
So on a spiritual plane, that interests me, because on a spiritual plane that sounds, it sounds very uplifting. But I'm wondering then, on sort of the down-to-earth, materialistic, day-to-day affairs, if I continue doing you damage, should you be forgiving me, or should you be coming to me and saying, you owe me an apology, and you owe me restitution, and you're not only doing damage to me, you're doing damage to our whole community until you change this?
It's a very different perspective.
It is? Okay, I get. Okay, now I know. I did not know this. That's very interesting.
In the 12 steps, there's a saying that having a resentment is like taking poison and waiting for the other person to die. So in this context, I mean, that forgiveness or lack of forgiveness becomes the poison. Do I continue to try to influence somebody to change who has no willingness to change, or do I just forgive them and I think there's another word other than resentment, though. You can have justice without resentment. You don't have to resent somebody even though you hold them culpable for something. Sorry, I stepped on you there.
That's
I
okay.
didn't. Please, go ahead.
Well, no, I was just say this whole, to me, the next step in forgiveness is blessing. And I believe that on a consciousness level, that our blessing someone even silently affects them, And so I can't convince them verbally or whatever, or shame them into changing. But if I can really, I think love changes people. And can I really love that person despite what they've done, and wish, confer blessings upon them, at least mentally, at least in my consciousness. To me, that makes a difference.
I think what you've done, in that instance, you've planted seeds. Now, where those seeds will take root and grow, we can't certainly predict. But at least there is the moment that person might just stop and think that somebody was good enough to them to offer forgiveness, and that's going to go deep inside, and at some point, hopefully, will grow.
Yeah. I remember when my husband and I were getting a divorce, And at one point, I said to him, you know, we know why we're getting a divorce. We know all of our differences and whatever. But I just want to tell you what I appreciate about you. And we sat down, and I told him everything I appreciated about him, the difference he'd made in my life. And he did the same thing. And we sat there and we just cried. And it was just, and then we had a divorce ceremony with his children and stuff, and just really, you know, tried to let go of that other stuff and just really, really praise and bless each other. And it doesn't mean that I was willing to stay in that relationship. There were differences that, you know, but to release him, I love this prayer. I love you, I bless you, I appreciate you, I forgive you, and I release you to your highest good. To just, you know, let that be.
It reminds me a little bit too much of, well, I shouldn't say too much, but a little bit, you know, old Jewish grandmothers and old Irish grandmothers that I knew too. You know, when a kid was being a brat, would just say, "You should only be well."
I heard the expression once, hell won't be full until you're in it.
Until you're in it.
The comment I heard, you should only have kids like yourself. I want to read something from the Vedic tradition, Swami Chinmayananda. Forgiveness is the secret beauty in any spiritual seeker's life. Not to forgive is to maintain the passions bottled up in us, and then we are never empty enough to lift ourselves in soaring meditations. And to me, that addresses that internal element, that regardless of what happens on the outside, forgiveness is about what I do and does it free me, and it may never change behavior, and I may confront behavior which may never change behavior, but it's about I get freed from holding on to that stuff. Let's talk about, we were talking about forgiveness. Let's talk about, you know, Tibetan Buddhists and China. I had a fascinating conversation with somebody who had actually been there. And I'm not going to share that right yet, but what do you see as the take on that situation?
Well, I think we see in His Holiness the Dalai Lama's example of what we mean by the spirit of forgiveness. I've never heard the exact words come out of His Holiness the Dalai Lama's mouth that he forgives the people of China and the leaders of China for what they have done to his country. But the actions and behavior that he exhibits are in line with that. And I think he's not holding on to any kind of resentment or anger towards the Chinese people, towards what has transpired there, the decimation of the Tibetan culture and the spiritual tradition there. So I think that this is an example for the world of how the Buddha himself says that hatred is never overcome by hatred; it's only overcome by love. There's no response to what we see in the world that meets it at that level that is effective, because all it does is create more hatred in the world. So these are the types of traditions that I try to follow in my own actions with others, that I think speak to the way that all of the issues in the world could be resolved, provided everyone's at the same table with the same understanding of how these types of behaviors don't really create anything that's positive in the world. What China has done to Tibet is not it's something that can certainly be forgiven and understood. And yet at the same time, I do get the point you're making in terms of also wanting to certainly help the change to happen. But the change doesn't happen if we're not being the example of the change we want to see happen.
I'm not far from that. I'm really not, because I if anything, I just object to sort of even introducing the word resentment here. I mean, I agree, resentment's a poison and it's a problem. But I guess the point that I was simply trying to make, and I think we're actually pretty close on that, is we don't have to speak in strictly polar terms only of I either resent or I forgave, I either hate or I love. I can hold somebody responsible without resenting them. Because the resentment, agreed, is not only going to it's going to poison me. There's a great flick that there's a Jewish organization called Aish Torah. They made a sort of a can't think of the word I'm looking for, like a cartoon before Rosh Hashanah last year. Father and son are driving along, the father's imparting some of his wisdom to the son, and the son is just, I'm so angry at this guy that, he messed me up at work, and he really stabbed me in the back, and this and that. And the father says to him, I hope you're charging him rent. And the son says, what? What are you talking about? He says, well, you're sure letting him live in your head. I hope you're charging him rent. So it's true, we don't have to resent. In fact, we shouldn't, because it will poison ourselves, and you're right, it'll poison the atmosphere in such a way that we're not going to fix anything. Right. But that doesn't mean that we have to absolve somebody of responsibility, because the person who did the wrongdoing is the person who's going to have to fix. And if they continue to do wrong, then if I'm interested not only in myself, but in our community, in our world, if you like, then I'm going to have to look at them and say, listen, I don't have to hate you. I will tell you honestly, as a young man, this was a very challenging lesson that my teachers tried to teach me before I went off to my army service in Israel. And my teachers in yeshiva worked very hard to get the message across to us. You don't need to hate the people that you may have to fight. You may have to fight them because it is the right thing to do, and you're going to be confronted with violence or with evil, and you're going to have to respond in a way that will stop it. But you don't have to hate them in the process. The truth is that requires a real maturity on our part and a real balance, which I think is a lot of what you're talking about. I don't think we're too far apart that way. So I never even thought of introducing the term resentment into the conversation, because that hadn't crossed my mind. Holding somebody responsible is what we sometimes have to do. Not forgiving them on the social plane could be because they have to know that they're still doing wrong and they're still harming the rest of us. But at the same time, you're 100% right. We don't have to resent people. We don't have to hate them. It's a very difficult and very mature balance that we're trying to strike.
That's a good point.
I want to come back to that.
I just wanted to add to that, having had a long experience with criminal offenders as a probation officer, you always approached it not out of, you never resented anybody who was sitting in front of me per se, but I would always tell them that part of their probation was that they had a responsibility to the community. And that was simply not to commit any more crimes, to get a job, to become a productive member. But I said that their success in that experience wouldn't be complete until they accepted their own responsibility in the action. And that's what caused a lot of people to repeat their offenses. They never got to that point of seeing where they were wrong. There was always society's wrong or somebody else is to blame. But for those folks who could accept the responsibility, but there was never, on my part, any resentment felt towards them. Matter of fact, some admiration for some of their creativity.
So we've got a fairly consistent message running through everybody's tradition.
I do have one thing I want to add.
Go for it.
And that is that I don't like the idea of God forgiving us, because I don't think God ever condemns. And so that whole idea of God forgiving us makes no sense to me at all. Because if God is love and only loves, then it's God as principle. I also like the concept of God as loving Father, Mother, but God as principle. The law of gravity doesn't withhold forgiveness from me if I stand up and fall off that table, So I just want to make sure I said that. I don't believe.
I think it's a place we're going to differ very strongly.
Well, this is a place that this was
good.
Well, I don't have that problem.
And you don't have to worry.
You get to sidestep the whole thing. Thanks a lot.
None of it's relevant.
I mean, this was a place I wanted to go to after we took a little break, but we could start there now, because I agree with you that, to me, forgiveness is really a secondary spiritual principle, and that the major spiritual principle is non-judgment. And if I can remove judgment, I don't have to have forgiveness. And I really believe, in spite of everything I did, in spite of my lack of belief, there was never a judgment to fill. but it took me a while to develop that, to get to that place, and then, which kind of brings me back to the question I wanted to ask all of you. All of you are talking about a very deep, what I'm hearing is a very deep level of forgiveness within traditions, that it's important, it's necessary. Why isn't the world getting the message? I mean, I'll add one other thing. I had a Sufi teacher who, in his context, what he called mercy, I believe, is unconditional love. And the way he taught was that there are 99 attributes to Allah in the Quran, and mercy is the highest of them. And the way he just talked about mercy was almost what you were talking about. He'd say that, you know, there's this big tree, and on one side of the tree sat a holy man, on the other side of the tree sat a thief. And the tree never withdrew shade from the thief or you know, gave it extra shade to the holy man, that they were all getting it equally, and that is how he saw mercy, that there was no judgment. So we have this context, I believe, of forgiveness defined slightly differently, demonstrated slightly differently, but still there. I mean, Jesus' last words, forgive them, Father, they know not what they do. Yet I don't see the world practicing forgiveness. Why is this message not getting out there?
I think it's because of our human limitations, that oftentimes ego, power gets in the way. On a wider geopolitical scale, turf, land, all sorts of issues get in the way in which we shut out God and God's message. And we keep hoping that one day the world will be transformed. But I just think it's our humanness.
I think it's largely it. I think that especially the ego element, the unwillingness to live with variety, which means living with differences. And I'm not saying that I don't think Jewish tradition is just like entirely liberal by any means, but we have a notion, for instance, the Mishnah says, Kol machloket shehi l'shem shamayim sofa litkayem, that a dispute which is for the sake of heaven doesn't mean that we're arguing. It means that the only attempt is to get at the truth, to get at the godly truth. So a dispute which is for the sake of heaven actually is a dispute which will survive. So wait a minute, I thought we want to do away with disputes. No, in fact, we don't have to, because differences and variety are in the material world, in the human world, how we express the unity of a godly truth. It filters down into the many colors and the many aspects of a world. But a machloket, which is not l'shem shamayim, a dispute which is because people are pursuing their interests, that's a dispute that cannot survive. So it sounds intuitively almost the opposite of how we like to talk in Western society. But the Jewish view is no, the dispute over genuine differences, over a pursuit of the truth, that's a dispute we actually want to maintain, and one that we can live with, one we should even want to live with. But the dispute where the egos got involved, and the example the Mishnah gives, is Moses and Korach. So here you have Moses, who's already been appointed by God, who's doing a pretty good job too, by the way. He's very faithful to what he's doing. His own ego is not getting in the way, but he's got this guy who, at least on the surface, is not very happy with the fact that he and his family got appointed the Hottentots. So what happens is we have a model of not being able to live with somebody else doing well, with somebody else doing things differently, with somebody else approaching things from the other angle. And I think that's right. I think that's the thing. It's that human element. So if we emphasize the godly element, if we pursue the godly element, then we find we can be more tolerating, we can be more forgiving. Although, as I pointed out earlier, we would also know when not to be forgiving, even while we have to work with the situation in front of us. But that's I don't think that's the message that's out there. Everybody's fighting over their version, you know.
Well, I mean, the message on the ground is different than the message that the base religion teaches.
Yeah, and a lot of it's just how we're brought up. I mean, I was brought up prejudiced, you know, in the South. And, you know, fortunately, I left there when I was 10 years old and went to Guam and had people of every color of the rainbow in my class and everything, and realized something was wrong with what I was taught back there. I wasn't taught about forgiveness. I didn't learn any of this stuff until I was in my mid-20s, and I found unity, and I got a whole different perspective on things. I mean, so it's passed on. What the sins of the father passed on for 7 generations. It's in our DNA, and fortunately, we can change our DNA. I really believe that. I believe that, you know, we can change those neural nets in our brain and learn different beliefs. But you know, Charles Fillmore, the co-founder of Unity, talked about race consciousness. Well, he was talking about the consciousness of the human race, and if you want to know what it is, turn on your television. Pick up the newspaper. That's the consciousness of the race. And it filters into our subconscious mind and affects the whole, you know, society. So you want to know why the word's not getting out there. That's why it's so important for each one of us to do our work.
I need to take a quick break, make a couple of announcements, and we can come back and solve the problems of the world in about 3.5 minutes. I believe, Brendan, when you have a couple announcements, you want to make everybody else was announcement free?
Very announcement free.
Okay, well, we got a couple of really exciting things coming up at Unity Santa Fe. This coming Sunday, March 17th, Julia Cameron, the author of The Artist's Way, will be starting a new 12-week workshop. It's an incredible opportunity we have in Santa Fe to be literally sit at the feet of the master as she teaches creativity through the artist's way. So that starts on Sunday, the 17th, and that morning, her class in the afternoon, that morning I'm starting a metaphysical Bible interpretation where we really look at, from the Hebrew Scriptures, we're focusing on the Hebrew Scriptures for about 10 weeks, and really looking at bringing those stories to personal meaning. You know, the Moses in me that wanders in the desert and doesn't ask for directions, you know, that really looking at those, what they represent in us, and even doing some psychodrama around it and role-playing some of the stories. And then the first Wednesday in April, we'll be starting Unity Metaphysics, which really goes deep into what unity means when it uses the word consciousness or, you know, Jesus or whatever, you know, really looking into the deep inner meanings of those.
Okay. I'll just make a quick announcement. Those of you who've been watching this show, you've heard this before, but for the 2 people who are tuning in for the first time, welcome. I am a spiritual counselor. I work with all beliefs. I work with non-beliefs. And I think what I'm hearing here, and why one of the reasons we did this show, was that forgiveness is a spiritual demonstration. Forgiveness is not an intellectual exercise, and it takes work to get there. And that's my job, to guide people to that place where they can start to learn how to let their spirit shine through as opposed to their ego shining through. I work on a donation basis, so money is not an object. You know, God takes care of me. If it's through you, fine. If it's not through you, that's fine too. God still takes care of me. So if that sounds like might be something that works for you, my contact information has been rolling. It will come at the end of the credits as well. Feel free to contact me. Be happy to talk to you, and maybe we could be of some service. So, we're back. This show was an outgrowth of a conversation you and I had over breakfast one morning. I don't even remember what the original topic was, but then you said, let's do forgiveness. And it just went boing, yes, we got to do forgiveness. And I'm singling you out because we have talked in the past about the idea of peace and reconciliation. That, to me, is a demonstration on ground level of What is forgiveness?
Yeah, I think that, I think specifically what you and I had talked about at one point too was the book by Desmond Tutu, No Future Without Forgiveness, in which he talks about the history of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa. I see forgiveness in the reconciliation process as almost being two interchangeable words, because what I said in the beginning, forgiveness, repentance really means a transformation, a turning around, metanoia in Greek. That reconciliation is a turning around, is a transformation, is a building up of a greater justice and a building up of the beloved community. Yeah.
Okay, anybody?
I think that it's important to keep in mind that forgiveness, and this is actually a little bit in response, sort of contra, but still in response to what you said. Forgiveness does predicate the idea that somehow I was judged for doing something wrong, that there's a right, there's a wrong, and if I did wrong, that seeking forgiveness is a responsibility that I have to assume. But that the forgiveness itself really shouldn't be my goal. My goal should be making things whole.
Right.
Making things whole between me and God, making things whole between me and people. And then forgiveness, hopefully, is the accompanying element that comes out of my righting what I've done wrong and trying to fix those things, and then seeking the forgiveness is part of my teshuvah, my return to God.
In the 12 steps we make, and they're very specific in its terminology, they call it amends. And I understand that because my second marriage, that's why it's my second marriage, I was active in my addiction, and I was constantly saying, I'm sorry. Until I got to the place where my second wife said to me, you know, Phil, you're the sorriest thing I've ever met. And basically what sorry meant was, I just did something, please ignore it because I'll probably do it again. Where amends comes in the steps in the context of, we go through creating a moral inventory. Here's the demonstrations I believe. The third step is turning my will and my life over. So the inventory comes after that. What does turning my will and my life over mean? And it means you have a set of morals now that you're going to practice. So now that I've tried to define them and implement them, I then get to make amends, because now there is, what you were saying, Rabbi, there's a certain amount of good chance I'm not going to repeat them. Because I was always repeating, I was always saying I was sorry. And I wish we can go on, but I'm getting signaled that we're almost out of time. I thank you all. This has been wonderful.
Right. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you.
Well, this is what we're here to do. I mean, to carry this message. I believe this world needs this message. And again, thank you all for being here with me. I want to thank you all for showing up, turning on your TV, actually listening through the whole show. It's a lot easier than it sounds. All that not forgiving carries with you is going to eat you up and destroy you. So until next week, walk in love and light, and blessings to you all. I'm Reverend Phil, and I've been your host for Words of the Prophets. Thank you for tuning in. Please join me again next week, same time, same channel, for more Words of the Prophets.